Hi, everybody. This is Eric Hynes, Curator of Film Museum of the Moving Image. Sorry about the slight delay. Seems like the invitations for our event went out a little bit late, so some folks are going to be showing up here as we begin, so I might talk really slowly to let everybody into the room. Thank you for your patience if you were waiting on that link. Welcome again to Reverse Shots Happy Hour. If this is the first time visiting us, this is something we've been doing since May. And it has become a beloved tradition here at Museum of the Moving Image and Reverse Shot to do this every week. And we've been several weeks in a row of thematic programming related to Halloween. I'm stepping back a little bit from that this week, but we'll also get there because our topic is going live, as it were, on location. You'll find out about very soon. But I want to thank you if you've been supporting the museum during this time. Thank you if you've been supporting us through our Kickstarter. That is ongoing. We're about a week and a half or so into our fundraising efforts to keep ourselves going in these weeks and months before we're able to get back into the building, and also to support online events such as this one. So as always, thanks for all that support. And without further ado, let's start today's session. There are three co-hosts for the Reverse Shot Happy Hour. They are the editors and founders of Reverse Shot, Michael Koresky and Jeff Reichert, and longtime contributor and filmmaker, Farihah Zaman.
Hey, Eric.
Hi, Michael. Hi, Jeff.
Hello.
Michael, hello, Farihah. Thanks for that intro.
How are you guys doing this week?
You know, counting down the days.
To what?
To what?
Apocalypse? Is that what we're calling it?
It's funny, I'm working on a project in which we're having to anticipate how do we try to guess how to film for a documentary if Trump wins, and how to film for a documentary if Biden wins, and just the theorizing about what those things might look like in terms of a public display of emotion is very telling and confusing and strange.
I can't even quite, I'm trying not to think ahead like that, but I guess in that field you have to, right? You're forced to think ahead. Whereas
kicking and screaming. My brain's like, no, I just don't want to look. Jeff's been trying to go on a news diet to limited success, I hear.
Yeah, I've been totally failing. I did really well for about a week, but since the first debate, I have been refreshing polls and aggregators and Twitter constantly, just kind of seeing what's happening out there. And that's how I became the first of our group to learn about the Rudy Giuliani bit in the new Borat film opening on Friday, which I'm very excited about. I don't know if people have heard about that, but it seems like Rudy Giuliani is filmed in a compromised position by our friend Borat.
Well, speaking of horror shows for Halloween.
Yeah, I think people are going to be inundated with that image that will be tattooed on their minds for the rest of their lives soon enough, so we don't have to do that to the poor, unassuming, unsuspecting viewers.
Yeah, few things could be.
Viewers, we hold this trauma for you so that you don't have to.
Yes, we're taking a little break. I mean, we're going to talk about Halloween stuff a bit, of course, but we wanted to talk a bit today about the Queen's Drive-In, which is why Eric is still staying. We actually have a man on location going to talk to us a little bit more about that in a second. But Eric, could you tee up the Queen's Drive-In just a little bit? We've talked about it here and there on the show, but what's happening?
Well, so the story of it is that back in May, New York Mario, whatever, the New York Governor Cuomo, the younger, not the namesake of the old Tappan Zee Bridge upstate, but the younger, determined that one of the few essential services that were allowable in May was drive-in theaters, and was the only way to really have public presentations of movies was that. And at that point, museum reached out to some partners to see if there may be a collaboration possible to make something like that happen out of nothing, because we don't have a drive-in theater at Museum of the Moving Image, nor really was there one in New York City at that time. And so we worked together with Rooftop Films and New York Hall of Science to build at the location at New York Hall of Science in their back lot a drive-in theater, and the idea, Rooftop Films is amazing. They do outdoor events and have done since, basically the turn of the century. And they're expert at making events happen in various locations and making them great, and showing great films. They have great programming as well. And so they were a natural fit, and they had already been doing work in this direction, thinking about what that could look like, what drive-in theaters could look like, where they could happen. But the location that we're working at New York Hall of Science was particularly attractive to us because it could be quote unquote semi-permanent, that we could actually, rather than a blow up screen that is fickle in terms of its stability and also its size, that we could construct a semi-permanent screen that could stay out there all season long. And instead of having to do Rooftop Films would normally do, pop-up locations and basically build a screen for a night or two and then move on, basically sort of do it right and do it ambitiously, and also be able to have top of the line projection by building a booth rather than sort of constructing a booth on site for that night. What if we built a booth and brought our projector over from Museum of Moving Image and do kind of top of the line presentation? It took months to make happen because though it was legal for the state, there was a lot of city loopholes. There's parks department issues that had to go through. There's permits. So it was a little bit late in the summer, later in the summer than we would have preferred to start, but it was early August. But it was complicated for 3 not-for-profits to make something like that happen. But the outcome was that while summer was still happening, we could show films again, and we could show films 5 days a week, and we could show for classics, we could show new films, and then also, and I'm sure we'll talk about this over the course of the hour, then figuring out exactly why people go to drive-ins, what they're expecting. Could you do something that's different than what they're expecting? And all these new challenges came to us as programmers and as exhibitors that were unforeseen, really. There's really no way to know until you start doing that, what that might entail. And as I think we've mentioned in recent weeks, it remains the kind of, still, it's the legal way to show films in New York City, at least. And so it was a main venue for New York Film Festival and other engagements coming up. So though it seemed like a potential, like solid, strong stopgap solution in the summer, we're deep into fall, and we might see if we go beyond that. So yeah, I mean, not where we expected to be, but also so interesting to be months and months into problem solving for drive-ins.
And it's a hit. I mean, everyone's talking about the Queen's Drive-In. I'm not saying that to just blow smoke. This is what everyone's talking about. Well, I mean, even the New York Film Festival took part in it. Go ahead, sorry, Farihah.
And New York Film Festival took part in the Brooklyn Drive-In, as well as a pop-up location in the Bronx. And so, like, and there have concurrent with ours, there are other drive-ins in the city. So there's really a density of something that didn't exist before.
I think that I mean, they're all great. I've definitely been drive-in hopping because what else am I going to do with my life? But I think that the Queens location, one of the things that's particularly special is that, like, it feels like a safe outdoor gathering space already. And not being a Queens resident, you drive in and you're like, oh, people come here to hang out on a Saturday night. And this is that spot in which, like, families are there in the parking lot. There's a beautiful, Hall of Science building. It just feels like you are entering another space in the way that it does when you go into a movie theater. And I really appreciated that. And then I also think about how we've probably, I don't know, I feel like I had associations with what you see at a drive-in in the way that there's certain movies that I'm like, ooh, I'm going to watch it on VHS because it'll be kitschy and fun. And remembering that if it's sort of technically up to scratch, that's not necessarily the case. Like, I had been relegating what I will watch at a drive-in to a certain space, when actually it 100% made me feel like joy and relief to be in front of a big screen and feel like I was being enveloped by a movie again in that way.
Yeah, and so just yesterday on Reverse Shot, we published the first of a 2-part Nick Pinkerton, I mean, the only thing to call it is an epic about the history of drive-ins. I'm going to drop that in the chat for you all right now. I think the next part we're going to launch tomorrow, right, Michael?
Yeah, everything with Pinkerton becomes an epic, which is one of the reasons why we love him. who's been writing for us for years. And anyone who reads his writing knows what an extraordinary writer he is. But I also just wanted to give a slight little preview. If you've read part one, it's such an in-depth in-depth dive into the history of the drive-in, and it is so detailed, and of course it's littered with amazing turns of phrase and critique. But part two, and this is why I consider it kind of like a Tocquevillian endeavor, is a completely different thing that's more of a surprisingly personal and critical take on the overall culture, and it goes into more of his philosophical ideas around the drive-in, and it becomes quite moving, actually, and there's some more anecdotal stuff. So definitely read part one to get yourself excited for part two, which is quite different.
Definitely. Good, Eric. I was going to maybe bring in Edo, because Edo Choi, the assistant curator of film for the Museum of the Moving Image, he's actually at the Queens Drive-In right now.
Jeff, he's live on location. You get to say that now. We've never done that at Reverse Shot Happy Hour before. Hi, Edo.
Look at that screen.
So the screen is lowered at the moment. It does get raised. It might even get raised while we're talking, but it goes down to the ground at this point for stability purposes overnight.
I've never seen it during the day, so it feels a little bit like wrong. It's like being in a museum at night.
Can you explain, show us a little bit where you are, Edo, and talk a little bit about the space?
Yeah, so I'm roughly in the final third of the field, and I'm sitting right next to our projection booth, which is basically two shipping containers stacked atop of each other.
Wow.
And there's the window, the port window for the projector. And the New York Hall of Science is to my left.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in a minute, I can take you guys up to the booth and we can take a look at it. Yeah.
What has it been? How's the process for you differed in adjusting to this very different space and showing movies in this space?
Edo, you want to go for that?
Farihah, you broke up a little bit for me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was asking as a curator how your practice has had to shift, if at all, in responding to the change in venue.
I think, first of all, when we started it, we knew going in that this was a partnership, and I think that's a big part of it. We weren't going to just be doing our own museum programming. We were going to be working with Rooftop and New York Hall of Science and trying to hit along the way each week different programs that would, find a balance between all of our kind of aesthetic or programming and curatorial sensibilities and priorities. And I think for the first few weeks, we had established a structure that followed that pretty well as our obligation to some of our funding partners, such as the Queensborough president, who sponsored the free screenings that we were offering on Wednesdays. And now we're about to offer, rather we just started 4 more free screenings that are sponsored by Councilman Moya with Black Panther this past weekend.
Wow.
And that's been a big part of what we're doing. And so I think the upshot really is that we're trying to be as community focused as possible. And that mandate really affects every decision that we made, operational, what the ticketing price was set at relative to other drive-ins, which are in the city. And then just also the films we're choosing relative to things that we might want to do in our brick and mortar space.
So how have you felt, or what have you seen in terms of response to the relative ambition or daring of viewers during this? Is there any, have you had a sense that people want to come to the drive-in to see something different? Do they want to come to the drive-in to see something they already know? Or is it a mix of the two?
I think it's a mix of the two, you know, and I think that there may be, I mean, it's a big space. It fits nearly 200 cars. It's also quite expensive. Like if we were a mom and pop drive-in that had this space and had certain staffing, like it would just be a lot cheaper to put on a production. But for us, this is actually not a cheap proposition, nor should it be, because it means that we're staffed and we're paying people that hadn't been able to do their jobs for a long time. So, but that does kind of raise the expectations a little bit. But that said, you know, like just like at the museum, we have a 267 seat theater, and we also have a 70 seat theater. There are certain programs that are perfect for one or the other, and sort of try to find a way of doing both that type of programming at the drive-in is a challenge, but it's worthwhile, you know. So maybe 4 out of 5 days of the week we're hoping for over 150 cars, and there might be one day a week where maybe that's a long shot, but it's absolutely worth it because, you know, we've had some events where maybe, you know, it's not as easy a sell because it's not Jurassic Park, say, which people are showing up for, and they're showing up for a film like that all over the country, even though it's widely available, but they're still showing up in their cars to see a film like that. We're showing some films that are one of a kind in the sense of like they've not been shown in theaters since, because festivals haven't even really had much of an opportunity to present these films. So you may have a lower expectation for some of those, and yet who the people are showing are incredibly enthusiastic, and that's been sort of a constant. No matter how many people, no matter how many cars are there is like a real sense of excitement around that, because whether it's because it's a film that you can't see otherwise, so thank God we get to see it on the big screen, or it's a film I've seen a million times and I just want to see it with other people. But the other thing that we've done, and I want to Edo talk to this a little bit, is pairing some of this too, and that's something we've adapted to. We didn't necessarily anticipate that, and then we realized, oh well, if there's an audience that wants to come see Moonstruck, and they're going to come to see Moonstruck anyway, maybe there's something else we can do while they're there that speaks to some of the stuff that we really want to be able to do curatorial.
I love that Moonstruck is just a classic at this point. But anyway, that's a different conversation.
And yeah, I mean, it's been fun, really. I think it's the thing is finding matches that you wouldn't really think of intuitively at first in like a normal situation. But in the drive-in, suddenly it makes sense that, oh, well, we really would love to show Nosferatu with a live score. But we also want to make sure that we're you know, for a silent film, which is only going to fill like half of our screen, that it's a program that's enticing to a wider range of audiences than we would normally get for like something like Nosferatu. So pairing it with Young Frankenstein puts a complexion on that program that I think is, you know, hopefully enticing to a broader audience. So yeah.
And the other thing about double features too is that wasn't an option when we opened in August, because it's just not dark early enough. So like the fun thing about extending into the fall, which is not something you would ever have to worry about if it were not a drive-in, you can just start doing things like double features more naturally.
Hey, Edo, I wonder if you could show us the booth where you were earlier. Is that possible?
Yes, okay. So I'm gonna fly around this way so that you guys can see the step and repeat that we made for the
cute little step and repeat.
On location and a tour.
And our incredibly attractive green generator. And okay, here we go.
As Edo's getting up there, I was going to say that as we see the space around him, the tough thing about only being able to do cars, not only does that limit people to really, you can only come if you have a car, but it's also a beautiful space there that could be adaptable to hybrid situations in terms of audiences. All right, so Edo's in the booth.
This is
okay.
What's going to happen?
Here we are.
I can't remember the last time I was in a projection booth.
I was probably March 11th at Museum of the Moving Image.
At Museum of the Moving Image, actually, yeah.
Edo, do you want to talk about what we're looking at with that tube?
Yeah, so one of the first engineering problems that we ran into in the booth when we were setting it up was exhausting the projector, which generates a hell of a lot of heat when the lamp is on. And normally this tubing, you know, it would go straight up into the ceiling, and we weren't getting enough pull from it. So we had to like build a second fan onto the fan and then pipe it right out the window. So that was an adventure. And then here's all of the films that we are showing or have shown.
Pile of hard drives. That's what films are now.
Yeah, that's apparently what they are now, right? And then here's our operators console. This is where Fred and Tom, our projectionists, make the magic happen.
And I'll say that, the fun thing about working with these organizations and doing something like this is that from the beginning, it was always, we're not just people are going to show up and they're going to watch movies. We're thoughtful about the trailers, we're thoughtful about the pre-show, we're doing a lot of short film content, and there's a live component almost every time where somebody from one of the three organizations introduces the program, gives it some context, which I think makes a difference in terms of just there's somebody on site with you when you're watching this thing. I think that's a general, that's expected of a lot of theaters, physical interior spaces as well as exterior ones. But in a moment where you can't be in a room with people right now, you have to be in separate cars. We just thought that would be something really important about being, feeling connected to the people who are putting on the show.
How are filmmakers responding to this? Like, can you share some anecdotes about folks who've been in to see their films?
Well, I think that's probably for me, I think one of the most important things about this is just being so aware during the pandemic how many films and filmmakers were supposed to be making their way around the world, finding audiences, festival wise, but then also studio wise, and being able to just do some version of a live presentation. The response has been really, really, really strong and really moving. I think there's, and I honestly, like, not to diminish what we're doing in terms of, like, it's cool, it's a drive-in, it's a big screen, but I think it's still not it. It's still quite not the same thing as traveling around the world, going from festival to festival. So though it's something more than a virtual presentation strictly. It's distant from what you expected enough there's a sense of, it's very moving, but there's a sense of sadness to it too. Like, we're all doing the best we can. And this, again, I don't mean to diminish the power of the drive-in and the value the drive-ins have on their own. And we're discovering that every single day. But to not forget that there's an element of this, we're adapting. We're adapting to a reality that may not be one we would prefer. So I think the filmmakers that we've been able to bring out, like I said, I think really appreciate it. But there's also a sense of, let's recognize that this is a joyful occasion, but it's also not a joyful time necessarily.
So we actually have a question from the audience, and maybe we could bring in Allisa after this question. But M says, how are you finding the response to films with subtitles?
That's a good question. We have it's become less of an issue than we may have thought it would be at first, because the screen is quite big, and so though there's quite of a throw, and if you're in the back of the theater, it may be a challenge for some, but unless you're dealing with aggressively small subtitles, the subtitles are visible. But it's it's a question, and even a question that we've discussed with distributors, that there's some insecurity around that, about whether or not it would be properly appreciated. I can speak for my experience in having been there and watching things from the booth area out back, is that it has not been prohibitive, and it's not really affected viewership experience as far as I know. But it is something to think about. I've been thinking about this, Jeff, in terms of, like, next year, like, if this goes on next year and this is actually remains a main venue for festivals going forward, I think it's a note. I think for filmmakers preparing their DCPs to maybe think about having an option of having subtitles slightly larger size, even if it's not preferred visually.
M has volunteered to type out transcripts to pass out at the theater, which I kind of love as the idea of a precious physical object as we return to our nostalgia for the physical and physical touch. And I just wanted to say, before we move on, to your point, Eric, around the fact that there is, like, a pleasure to the drive-in in and of itself. Like, of course, part of it is we're looking for some shadow of what we can't have. And I don't want to gloss over that either. But I think also what we're looking for is novelty, like anything that feels like a new and complete experience on its own, because it's something that has existed for a long time and, like, has a kind of apparatus around it in the way that it works. Like, yes, there's things I love about it because it's reminiscent of going to the theater and like I want to go to the concession stand, but there's so much about it that's like worth, and I think this is why Nick's article is so fascinating. There's so much that's worth investigating just about this very particular, very novel experience of being both together and apart.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh, go ahead, Eric.
No.
I was just going to bring on Allisa, since we are talking about, drive-ins in this moment and how they've adapted, how they're different. Allisa, as most people probably know, Allisa Wilkinson is the film critic at Fox, and she's actually also working on a big piece about drive-ins that takes, I think, a somewhat less historical view than what Nick has done, and looks more at kind of contemporary drive-in situations. So would love for her to join us now.
Hello.
Hey, Alyssa.
Hey
Hey,
guys.
Allisa.
Hello. I brought Forky with me. Emmy winner Forky. He wanted to join.
A drive-in.
Yeah. He should come to a drive-in.
Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, I'm glad I could. It's nice to see people's faces, like the top and bottom of their faces.
Except for Edo, of course.
Except for Edo.
So we got a quick peek.
Sorry.
I've noticed that catcalling has not ended despite the fact that everyone is masked, which is like really, I don't know why it surprises me, but it's kind of, speaking of novelty, I'm like, really? Okay. I guess
think
now
it's
I
kind
know
of
it's not about me.
It's kind of a nature is healing moment where you're like, oh yeah, I'm still in New York.
A friend of mine got catcalled early in the process, or early in the pandemic time, wearing a mask and wearing like jogging pants and whatever, and the person, the friend of mine looked over at the person catcalling, and the person catcalling said, "Hey, I'm trying."
That is the most pleasant catcalling exchange I've ever heard, honestly. Yeah, feels honest, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Alyssa,
Yeah.
Jeff set up, the nature of your article a little bit, which is more broad in terms of thinking about how multiple theaters and multiple cities, venues, situations, some are for festivals and temporarily set up, are responding to, this need for big screen movie culture. And I would love for you to talk about that a little bit more and sort of the research that you did going into this piece.
Yeah, I've been talking to people who are running drive-ins all over the country, which is really interesting to even just research, because there are people who have been running drive-ins for years and now suddenly find themselves in like a totally new situation. And then there are people who, just never thought of running a drive-in until this happened. And it's kind of inspiring in a lot of ways. So I talked to people in Maine, I talked to people in Austin, I talked to folks in Missouri, I've been talking to people in Newark, so kind of talking to people all over the place. And one thing that's really struck me is how much all of the drive-in owners think about their local community, which isn't a surprise, of course. Like independent theater owners have always been doing this, but they really have a pulse on what their community wants and is interested in, and also like things that would be important that are outside of the just the movie experience. So of course, like for instance, concessions is an interesting case, because in New York, to my knowledge, we still can't have those, but in other places they're driving up food trucks, which have been suffering like everybody else because there's less pedestrian foot traffic, or they've been like thinking of ways to partner with local restaurants that are struggling and actually being able to rehire people. And then when they think about programming, they're thinking a lot about, I think, outside the box, like you guys have been at the Queens Drive-In. The people who are willing to pay and come back to the drive-in over and over are often people who really are missing the theatrical experience a lot. So a lot of what they've been thinking about is movies that appeal to, I guess, like cinephiles, and to families. So those two groups are really, because you can pile your whole family into the car. It's a fun outing if your kids are restless. In some states, you can get out of your car and sit near it, which makes it extra fun. I was talking to the folks in Maine, in Camden, where the Camden Film Festival just happened, and they said, we kind of turned, it's a small town, it's Maine, they haven't had hardly any cases, and so they said it's kind of become like the thing to do on the weekend. And actually they wound up constructing a projector that looks like a lighthouse, which is very much in keeping with the area. It looks super cool. The pictures are awesome, with the light coming out, pointing at the screen when it's projecting. So I think all of that has been really interesting. There's also been a lot of chat about drive-in concerts, because you can repurpose the space and just like put a band on a stage and people will come to that, using that for fundraisers. And also just thinking about like, what is it their community is craving and needing, whether it's like a place to gather or certain kinds of movies to watch. One person I talked to owns the Moonlight Drive-In in Newark, which just opened this year. It's one of the few Black-owned theaters in the country, and it might be the only Black-owned drive-in. They also are focusing on a lot of programming that focuses on stories like created by or starring Black actors. And you know, she said, oh, we've had people driving up from Maryland to go to this because it was so exciting. She said a very diverse crowd, but they built it in an old football stadium. So there's a lot of room and there's a lot of camaraderie that goes on there. And it was like a very exciting thing for the community. Yeah. So I think all of that has been really interesting, and just thinking also about how our drive-ins going to continue. So normally they'd be shutting down around now in most places. And, you know, the one in Austin was like, well, it's not, it's fine. We can run all year round.
Right.
In Maine, they were like, well, we don't want to kill anybody. So we have to shut down when it gets below a certain temperature. So those are the challenges that they're thinking through. But I also think people will probably brave it as long as they possibly can. Bring some blankets and some glove warmers and
the biggest issue is staffing, you know, be able to keep the staff safe, because folks can be in their cars and regulate their temperature, but the staff is more of a challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I loved hearing you talk about the Moonlight too, because you know, we've been thinking about how people who are missing a movie theater experience go, and of course we're drawn by particular movies and the curation practice, but I'm sure there's also ways in which it's an opportunity to get people to go see movies they would never normally see, because hey, it's something to do on like a short list. And it does feel like, you know, we were talking a little bit before the show started about how the drive-in, maybe more so than going to a movie theater, feels like a special event. And I feel like rather than that having been normalized by going all the time, it's only carried over. Like the feeling that I'm going to do this special thing comes along, and I have that little bit of like childlike excitement about it every time, even though I know that it's sort of being driven by really difficult circumstances.
Yeah, and it's something to look forward to, which is, for me, what I've been missing. And it's just like, I don't have anything to look forward to a lot of the time on my calendar except some nebulous future. So it's this, like, I bought a ticket and I can go. And I have gone to one drive-in this summer. I went to the one that Rooftop popped up in Brooklyn on the Brooklyn Army Terminal, and saw Bloody Nose Empty Pockets, which I had seen probably 4 times already. But it turns out that it was a great drive-in movie, which I wouldn't have believed. It's, you know, a documentary kind of about a dive bar, which you can't do any of those things right now, but it felt very resonant in a different way, just because I was near other people and we were honking at the end to signal our appreciation and all of those things that you kind of don't do.
We had the Ross brothers on an earlier episode to talk about Bloody Nose Empty Pockets, and since you brought it up, I just wanted to say I've also really loved that movie, and one of the stars of the film passed away in recent months, so it's a great tribute to him. I think that the film got to have this life in drive-in theaters, and I think like part of what you're talking about too, Allisa, is like you can be rowdier at the drive-in. There's like there's a social behavior that's acceptable in that space that I don't even want in a sit-down theater. I did find the honking alarming at first. I was like, I feel like I've done something wrong or bad and I'm in trouble. And I was like, it's okay. It's just car applause.
Hmm.
I'm,
Yeah.
I'm curious to ask Allisa and Edo, as people who probably know a lot more about drive-in movies than I do and the experience of drive-in movies. Like, how do you feel about the experience? I'm really interested in all the different kinds of experiences we have with cinema. We watch them in many different ways, even different theatrical ways. Edo, you wrote a piece for Reverse Shot a few months ago that was all about being a projectionist.
Yeah.
And also, you know, the ways that we see and the ways that we even catalog movies kind of in our minds. Like, how do you square the drive-in experience, and how do you see it as cinema? I'm curious to both of you.
Well, I will say one thing that struck me was that I felt the kind of anticipation before the movie started that I don't always feel when I'm like sliding in at the last minute to my reserved seat at, you know, Nighthawk or whatever, because the sun was setting. So we were like watching the sunset and like getting ready, like it's going to be dark soon and we're going to watch the movie together. And, you know, there's the pre-show, which is sort of, you know, it's just sort of like welcome and stick around for the Q&A afterwards. But that to me was really kind of lovely and something that I miss, because I don't show up as a critic most of the time. I don't show up and even watch trailers. We've just kind of dive right into the thing that we're watching. On the other hand, cars are not comfortable. They're not comfortable places to sit.
That's true.
And not every movie theater is comfortable either. And, you know, every critic in New York has a ranked list of what theaters they like best and worst, and we won't talk about that here. But I was struck by how uncomfortable the car that I had comfortably driven just before that suddenly became. So I was thinking a lot about like my body and the space I was in a way that I can totally zone out when I am, you know, in a theater. But I didn't have extraneous lights the way I do when I'm at home. So I can recreate a pretty decent experience at home, but I don't have surround sound, which I don't really in a car, but it's better than it is at home. And I don't have like my doorbell isn't going to ring, or like, you know, there's not like my clock or anything like that. It's just quiet. So that, I think, as far as the immersion or the attentiveness part of it, was a little better. Although I wondered if you were tempted to take out your phone, if you would do it more in a drive-in. I don't know. Edo, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I like in my limited experience, because really I don't have much experience seeing movies at drive-ins, but in my limited experience seeing them, like going back to when I was a kid, it was a special thing, right? Most of the time, mostly we don't have access to drive-ins anymore, and haven't, as long as I've been, you know, for the last 20 years at least. It's a rarefied experience. But one of the things about it that always struck me is actually sort of what Allisa mentioned about the physical discomfort of it. You know, when you're in a car, you're constantly reminded that you're in something that's meant to be moving, and yet the total cognitive dissonance of the experience is that you're still and you're watching something else move. And in a normal black box movie theater, the kind of idea or the concept behind it is the annihilation of all the rest of our senses except what we see and what we hear. And you just don't get that experience in a drive-in. It's a much more competitive experience. Your senses are competing, and your body is competing for attention versus what you're actually, you know, purportedly there to watch. And I had this experience vividly during the one drive-in show I actually got to see during this time, because for the most part I've been so focused on helping administer our little drive-in that I haven't really been able to go in a car and watch something. But I did for days, the Simon Leong at Brooklyn Army Terminal during the New York Film Festival. And it's anyone who's familiar with Tsai's work will know that his major collaborator and muse, Li Kangshen, has had severe neck and back pain, unexplained neck and back pain for much of his much of his life. And the films actually build this into their narratives and into the characters that he plays. And that week, I happened to be suffering the worst neck and back pain of my life. I was being woken up. This pain was so bad. And to see the movie in a car, I was in the back seat of the car, and I had to hunch while also going through the worst back pain of my life. There was kind of nothing quite like the odd symmetry of the experience watching it. And I think it really, I mean, it was painful, it was awful, but I think it really helped me experience the film in a way I never would have otherwise. And it's, you know, it's also a film that's very much about isolation, and it just really spoke to me on many levels in terms of arriving right now at this time. So yeah, anyway.
I have to say, it's not just, in case people haven't seen it, it's not just like subtextual that, you know, you might know that this actor Lee Kang-sheng has had neck and back problems. Like there's like a 20-minute scene in the movie of him getting very painful looking acupuncture and burning treatment on his neck and back. So I can't even imagine that experience for you. I'm sorry, but I'm sure it was meaningful in many ways.
I will say though,
agonizingly sublime.
Sorry, I was just gonna say I completely agree about like we're just not used to contorting our bodies for this purpose out of a vehicle, and that is a fact. But if we're gonna talk about distraction, maybe it's my like documentary filmmaker thing, but I'm so much more distracted by other human beings and like their sounds and movement and how they're responding to the movie. Like I'm that annoying person in a theater. So that it was interesting to have that removed, like having a very, again, like it's somehow more expansive than at home, but still a sort of like a way of engaging with the outside world with just one or two other people, which I found interesting. I hadn't done it in a long time. And I'm curious, like people keep alluding to their personal history with the drive-in movie theater experience. And I would love to hear everybody's, you know, do you have like a particularly warm old memory or like the first time you went to the drive-in? What's your story with the drive-in?
Well, I'm just going to say two things. One, just to speak to what you just said, Farihah, which is that one parallel that has been interesting in terms of the drive-in with the traditional theatrical experience is that I've found that though, of course, you could be in a car with two or three people texting and you'd see their phones, but generally it's not as distracting, I think, in that space. But if people have their headlights on, it's the equivalent of somebody with their bright phones.
100% true. Yeah.
You know, all of a sudden you're just aware of other light, and that's the other light other than the cell phone, which would be in the movie theaters. But I'll just say briefly that it was a little bit different than a nostalgic experience for me in movie theaters. But I wrote a piece for the New York Times in 2012 that went into drive-in theaters quite a bit with the idea that that was the year when, you know, Hollywood was basically shifting over to DCP from 35 millimeter as the industry standard. And there was a sense of panic around that time for mom and pop theaters, seasonal theaters, drive-ins, that they would have to go out of business because they just could not afford the new, you know, hardware to make that happen. Now, actually, not miraculously, for good reason, a lot of those places did remain open because basically they accepted money from, you know, from the companies that were then going to furnish and be able to dictate what films get shown in those spaces. In a sense, became a venue that programming was dictated by Hollywood itself, and that's how they stayed open. And so it's interesting, 8 years having visited those business people, visiting those spaces, loving the drive-in experience, in a sense, feeling like this was it. And then 8 years later, finding ourselves back here and grateful for those that exist and grateful for those that are able to pop up out of nowhere. And in a sense, I think because Hollywood's not releasing films right now, we're kind of taking the spaces back and making creative choices rather than having our programming dictated by Hollywood.
Allisa and Edo, what are your personal experiences? Any anecdotes from the past?
From the drive-in, at the drive-in, if you will.
Well, it was illuminated that we may actually have experiences at the same venue. So I'm still going to
feign surprises if I'm just hearing it.
so the only place that I really went to the drive-in as a child was consistently went was on summer vacations in Cape Cod with my family. There's a drive-in in Wellfleet, which is in the outer arm of, so if this is Cape Cod, it's Wellfleet's like right here. And it was really the only place to see movies during the summer when we were out there. And it was all kind of commercial films from the late 90s, early 2000s that I saw there. I saw things like Rush Hour 2 and Independence Day. But most memorably, because often we didn't have much choice, it was just whatever double feature of a new releases that were playing that week or that month. I remember vividly, we went to go see Blue Crush, the surfing
drive-in movie.
Yeah, and we all were just like, we couldn't believe we had bought tickets to go see this movie, and it was one of the most enjoyable experiences I've ever had. I'll never forget it. Yeah, it was great. It was terrific. Kate Bosworth and Michelle Rodriguez and that whole, that was the time. It was great. It's awesome.
So it turns out the other drive-in I've been to is also the Wellfleet drive-in. I don't, and I'm not from the Cape Cod area, but when I got married in 2006, which is like a lifetime ago now, we went to Truro, which is on that part of the Cape, for our honeymoon. And we were there for, I guess, 5 days or something like that. And we had a car, which being New Yorkers was like it was a novelty. We were real excited. We were also like 22. And so we were like, what should we do with the car? So we decided to go to a drive-in, because what else are you going to do? We went there, and I was just looking up what exactly we saw. So it was a double bill of Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest, which I believe had just come out. And then the other movie was Invincible, which is the Mark Wahlberg football movie, or something like that.
Michael just went through a roller coaster of emotions.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it was very much, and this is what's kind of charming about drive-ins, is you choose to, or in, the before times anyhow, you choose to go and then you just kind of see whatever is there. It's not like you pick the movie you want to see, which is changing. But at the same time, it's not changing. I mean, what's the drive-in in New Jersey that plays 35 millimeter? I'm blanking. There's a drive-in in New Jersey that plays 35 millimeter, and it's mostly like old, like sea horror. But you're going for the experience, and so this was the same thing. And we're pretty sure we had already seen the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, and thus only stayed for Invincible and then left. But yeah, I mean, it was like a funny thing to do. It was also, I mean, I was pretty young, and so it felt like a very like, oh, we're the adults now, like we are making these choices ourselves experience. And so for years that was the only drive-in we would talk about it, and just all I remember about the movie is it was bad, and that's it. But yeah, same one. And it's also like Edo said, it's like, it's a beach town. It's like full of people who are on vacation. Yes, Mahoning, that's the one. Mahoning is the drive-in with the 35 millimeter. But when this summer we contemplated renting a car and driving out there, and it was like triple bills of movies that nobody except aficionados have ever seen, but that's why you go. And so that memory is it's like a very fun, glowy memory that I was thinking about this summer, sitting out watching Bloody Nose, Empty Pockets, a movie about the end of the world.
Given that we're in Halloween time, I understand there is a lot of Halloween programming going on at the Queen's Drive-In. I wonder if we could hear a bit about what people could see over the next week or so.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm so glad that we're still programming at this time of year, because it's just kind of fun to show some of these films. And we're starting off this weekend, we're doing a double feature of Hitchcock's The Birds and Psycho. And Psycho is a new 4K restoration, so I'm excited to
Oh.
see that on that screen.
It feels like a great drive-in movie. I haven't seen it that way, but it seems kind of perfect.
Well,
For
who
me,
Yeah,
like-
I mean, that was the idea. One having key scenes in the car, and the other being an outdoor movie, really, for the for large and also as claustrophobia.
it's grinding aesthetic. It doesn't have that expansive Hitchcock beautiful cinematography. It has like a flat TV look, and I just feel like it would be really striking in a drive-in.
Yeah,
no,
those scenes in a car are all those they're all the rear projection shots, so you really feel that space of the car in a way you wouldn't. Yeah.
And I feel
And
like when people talk about horror being a good fit for the drive-in in general, we focus more on the idea that like contemporary horror movies are schlocky or something. But I think that that's only part of it, and often it's not about the quality of the horror movie. It's the fact that in a car you feel more exposed than what you do in your home or even in theater. There's so many like urban legends about, you know, the tap on the car and being surrounded by this dark expanse, especially because a lot of them are in more rural areas, that I think it definitely adds a sense of atmosphere
Yeah.
to the proceedings.
And just to rattle off some of the things, we're showing Get Out and the Babadook. We're showing
Mhm.
a Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween. We're showing Little Shop of Horrors and Beetlejuice, and also Coco on November 1st, which is the perfect day for showing.
Yeah, Day of the Dead.
Your Beetlejuice Little Shop of Horrors double bill is like giving me fits. That's another great pairing idea. My introduction to the drive-in, because I mostly grew up in India, and there's a different relationship there with like roving theater, and like cinema that moves, but in a totally different way. I would not describe it as a drive-in.
Right. The screen is getting driven in. But
I mean, I guess actually now that I'm saying it, that there's something like very quintessentially Americana about the drive-in to me. And I didn't have that experience until I returned to the States for college, and I went to school upstate, and the Hyde Park movie theater, which is still going strong from my understanding. It was just this perfect confluence of like classic American drive-in stuff. Like we went to go see Freddy versus Jason. We were a bunch of college kids in the middle of the woods, and we went in my friend's like huge pickup, packed in a way that would be unhealthy and unsafe now. And I also, I don't know why this was part of my enjoyment, but my friend, the reason why we went is because my friend was on a date that she didn't want to be perceived as a date. So she's just asked a bunch of people, and it ended up being like 10 people crammed in to this pickup, and we like put the flatbed down and laid blankets and, you know, just rolled around and watched this totally over the top horror movie, and it was wonderful. And I didn't see another movie at the drive-in for a long time, so it's so different going back to the Queen's Drive-In and seeing a double bill of Stray and Bulletproof, which were like docs that I was so excited to see, and are both directed by friends of mine, and to sort of like reframe what the experience of drive-in is that way.
Yeah, I when I think back upon my first experience at the drive-in, it's just it was August 2020, and
It's a different world, man.
No, but seriously, the first time I ever went to a drive-in was this past summer. So I don't know if I ever would have, if not for the pandemic. It was a horror double feature of The Rental and Relic. And Relic is actually a pretty interesting movie. I'm not so sure it was the place to watch it. The Rental felt like a genuine kind of update of a schlocky drive-in movie. It's like an Airbnb slasher movie directed by Dave Franco. Where else would I have watched that? So I'm happy to have seen it. I guess I was skeptical before going in, because this has kind of happened out of necessity as opposed to any kind of artistic or altruistic reason. But I really had a great time, and it was a completely different experience, and it was very eerie outside. And I remember the way that the moon looked, kind of rose behind the screen, and the way that you could see the outlines of the trees. It felt very evocative of like a childhood thing that I never had done. and I really enjoyed that. Though I wanted to go to the drive-in as a kid. They weren't abundant, but there was always some mention in the newspaper. I grew up in Massachusetts. There was some mention in the newspaper of a couple local drive-ins, and I would always kind of beg my mom to go to the drive-in, and she would just always say, "Oh, you don't want to do that, Michael. That's a terrible way to watch a movie." So it just never happened. And then by the time I was driving myself, they just weren't close enough for it to be an easy Friday night thing to do. So 2020, first experience.
I mean, if you're being completely honest, you were also lured by pizza egg rolls. I think that was your primary.
That I didn't end up getting because they sold out of them.
I forgot about that.
What about Jeff? So Jeff grew up in Southern Jersey and has a whole film exhibition lineage. I'm curious about his experience. You're muted, Jeff. Rookie move.
Man, total rookie move for late 2020. I was texting my mom before the show because I have clear memories of being in certain cars at movies at drive-ins, because there was a drive-in in my town. And she's pushing back on me and saying that they never took me to the drive-in. And so we're going to have to get into it after the show. And so the first drive-in I really remember is probably, it may well be the same double bill that Michael saw, because we were all there together. But I did go to the Queens drive-in for the first time to see Lizzie Borden's Born in Flames, which was sort of, it's kind of an unexpected pick for a drive-in in a certain sense.
Great pick.
There was something really nice about feeling New York so present while watching that particular very New York movie. And, it worked in a way that I didn't expect, and differently than it had when I saw the movie, at BAM a few years ago.
That's a great one. Yeah, that sense of community. You can feel that even isolated in the cars. There's been a lot of talk about the honking, and in part 2 of Nick's piece, which will go up tomorrow, there's a whole thing about a recent screening and the surprising honking culture of it.
Should we toast being alone together?
Alone together. Yeah, well, that's what we're doing now.
Yeah.
That's perfect. So yes, it's that time of the happy hour where we toast. Does everybody have their whatevers?
Just finished mine, but
That was
And then
literally.
you can
I'll raise a microphone too.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
And a new one. We
I
should
wanna
play
shout
bingo.
Shout out our reverse shotters that have tuned in: Julian Allen, James Wham, Jordan Kronk, Justin Stewart, Ryan Swen, Susanna Gruder, and Chris Wisniewski. And also want to shout out Joshua Bilness, who literally, we would not be doing the Queen's Drive-In without his support. So thanks for tuning in, Joshua. And thank all of you for being here for this week's happy hour.
And we should say next week, a special Halloween blowout on Halloween Eve. So make sure to come back next Friday, 5 o'clock. We're going to have a ton of people on. We're going to be talking scary movies. There may be costumes.
It's a party.
Going back to Fridays.
Yeah.
Be there.
All right.
Thank you
Cheers.
both for being here, Alyssa, Edo.
Thanks for coming.
So great seeing you.
thanks. Yes.
See you soon.